This week on Act Out, updates from two frontline climate fights in the ancient forests of Northern California, as well as the harbor of New York City. Next, the biggest polluter on the planet is also the world's largest terrorist organization. Here's what we need to reckon with when it comes to legitimately fighting climate change, unifying across false divisions, and really addressing all of the ills perpetuated by our system. One of which includes BlackRock. Diana Best with BlackRock's Big Problem sits down with us to talk about the shadowy world of asset management and global chaos capitalism. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. You may recall our interview from episode 206 with a forest protector in the Mattole watershed who spoke about the critical work of saving ancient forests from logging and the grotesque practices of an industry that claims to uphold sustainability while irreversibly destroying the very lungs of our planet. Well, in early June, the Humboldt Redwood Company started felling trees and doing road work in the Mattole forest. On June 10th, Rook, a forest protector, climbed into an old-growth Douglas fir and set up a tree sit. As of the recording of this episode, they are still there. That same day, elders were arrested at the entrance gate to the logging site, where elders, youth, and various community members and visitors had been blocking loggers' access to the forest for consecutive days. On June 12th, a local activist U-locked themselves to a cattle grate, blocking and delaying the arrival of loggers to the area. On June 13th, protectors visited Humboldt Redwood Company offices to stage a protest and action demanding that the aptly acronymed HRC leave the forest and the tree sitter alone. Actions continue as the standoff intensifies and trees continue to be felled. Support is needed on the ground, financially and remotely. Donations can be made at the link below, which we'll of course include in our show notes. If you can't make it out to camp now or in the near future, email EFHUM, as in mother, at riseup.net. Folks are asking that everyone continuously call HRC and demand they stop logging and herbiciding and harassing protectors. If you're watching, take a screenshot. If you're listening via podcast, go to Save the Mattole Ancient Forest on Facebook, or check out my Twitter at ActivistEleanor to see the list of names and numbers. We can all do something to lend our strength and will to this fight, and we have to. As Rook noted in their post from last week, I sit up in my perch, listening to the thunder of trees falling, close, across the creek on Brushy Ridge. 14 so far this morning. I think about a future without forests. Trees are falling down the coast from so-called British Columbia to California. 15 trees down. Cedars, firs, redwoods becoming lumber, pulp, biomass, tree plantations, smoke. Whatever their intentions, the men who guard this tree, who hunt us in the woods, who escort the loggers to work each morning, are doing their part to create the future their descendants will inherit. One of famine, climate migration, global poverty. 19. They are enabling the ecological collapse. They are making me watch the destruction of a place I love. We're fighting for a better world, and they're in the way. 20 trees down. The action call information will be posted on our show notes, and please be sure to share with all of your networks. Next up, some good news from the other coast. Another disgusting project that we've covered before in episode 196, the Williams Pipeline is a proposed fracked gas pipeline that would run literally through New York City's harbor, at a time when locals are newly rejoicing at the resurgence of marine wildlife such as dolphins and whales, thanks to community efforts to clean up and stop pollution. Needless to say, the Williams Pipeline would be a disaster, not only for the marine wildlife, but for human residents as well, dredging up decades of chemicals for the sake of a fuel no one wants or needs. But on June 5th, New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy conditionally denied several of the last needed New Jersey permits for the Williams Northeast Supply Enhancement (NESE) pipeline. The news came less than a month after New York State regulators, thanks to continued pressure from activists, denied the Williams pipeline operators a critical water quality permit. And while both of these points are cause for celebration, the fight is not over. Both New York's May decision and New Jersey's June 5th decision to halt the pipeline include conditions which allow for the pipeline company to reapply, quote, as long as the revised application provides additional measures to mitigate environmental harm. This leaves the door open for Williams' company to throw down some hardcore greenwashing in an attempt to sway regulators. Indeed, less than 1 week after New Jersey conditionally denied the pipeline's 6 necessary permits to operate, M.J. Bradley & Associates, on behalf of Williams' company and National Grid, released a misleading and cherry-picked report claiming the Williams-Nice fracked gas pipeline would lower greenhouse gas emissions. As the group Stop the Williams Pipeline notes in their press release on the report, that's some bullshit. Well, they put it more eloquently. Science and justice make it clear that fracked gas is a climate disaster, and Williams' National Grid misrepresenting the facts doesn't change that. This is the same kind of delay and deceit that we've seen from the likes of ExxonMobil, attempting to block meaningful climate action. Methane, a greenhouse gas even more potent than CO2, is leaking at frightening rates from fracking wellheads along transportation routes, and from the outdated infrastructure in our city and into our homes. For New York to meet our climate justice goals and for Governor Cuomo to fulfill his commitment for a Green New Deal for New York, we must stop the Williams fracked gas pipeline for good. To stay up to date on this fight, visit stopthewilliamspipeline.org and find them on social media. Next up, a recent report outlines the dire science behind the fact that the DoD, our war machine, is the world's largest institutional user of petroleum and, correspondingly, the single largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world. The report, put out by the Costs of War Project at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, tracks energy consumption in fuel, installation and operational energy use, vehicle fuel consumption, such as jet fuel, overall greenhouse gas emissions, and more. One summary finding from the report estimates that between 2001 and 2017, the U.S. military has emitted 1,212 million metric tons of greenhouse gases. In 2017, for instance, the Pentagon's greenhouse gas emissions were greater than the greenhouse gas emissions of entire industrialized countries such as Sweden or Denmark. In other words, our war machine is the main cause of the 2 biggest reasons for socio-political unrest and instability in the world: war and climate change. And in a sick, cyclical death spiral, our military uses climate change and the impending destabilization as reasons to ramp up the military budget, thereby creating a self-fulfilling and accelerating homicidal prophecy. Meanwhile, one of the primary objectives of the military-industrial complex is to uphold the fossil fuel industry. It's why we went into Iraq. It's why we want to invade Venezuela. It's why we're allies with Saudi Arabia and give literally 2 shits about their ongoing human rights violations and the genocide of the Yemeni people. In short, the only thing that can save us from both the horrors of war and ongoing climate catastrophe is to kill the military-industrial complex. And it's vital that we recognize this as we move forward in our climate justice work. Not only do we need to highlight the intersections of movements such as the climate and anti-war movements, but we have to recognize that we cannot be saved simply by eating less meat or recycling. And this is not to say that you shouldn't do those things. You should. You should also wipe your ass after going to the bathroom, but I don't really feel the need to tell you that because it's so obvious. I may as well tell you that walking requires you to put one foot in front of the other. In a recent op-ed, Mary Hegler, who works in the environmental movement, wrote, "The belief that this enormous existential problem could have been fixed if all of us had just tweaked our consumptive habits is not only preposterous, it's dangerous. It turns environmentalism into an individual choice defined as sin or virtue, convicting those who don't or can't uphold those ethics. When you consider that the same IPCC report outlined that the vast majority of global greenhouse gas emissions come from just a handful of corporations, aided and abetted by the world's most powerful governments, including the US, it's victim blaming, plain and simple. It also suggests that if you just go vegan, throw solar panels on your house, and ride your bike, the world will be saved. But this thinking is just another manifestation of the divide and conquer strategy of a capitalist system based on extraction and destruction. It shames people who can't afford or have access to new technologies or green choices, and further cleaves our potential at unification along the lines of greenwashed purchasing power. As neighborhoods fall to tsunamis of gentrification, eco-chic, tech-trendy, and hipster green industries roll in, shaming those who can't afford their consumerist wares while making those who can afford them feel good about their greenwashed purchasing power, all the while ignoring the aforementioned handful of industries, not to mention the war machine that's really to blame for this worsening climate crisis. So here again, we see how these issues fit together. The gentrification versus revitalization issue, the economic inequality issue, race, gender, climate justice, war, all of these stem from the same sick, twisted system that's making money off of literally throwing fuel onto the fire of a global crisis. And as more and more capital concentrates in smaller and tighter circles, the targets for a coordinated attack become more obvious. Take, for instance, BlackRock, an asset management firm that you probably haven't heard of, that has garnered attention from the likes of anti-war group Code Pink and environmentalists for their staggering investments in both war and dirty energy. Indeed, at the BlackRock shareholders meeting on May 23rd, a multitude of groups, from the National Indigenous Organization of Brazil to Yemeni rights activists, came together to call out BlackRock's CEO and the entire company on their massive and grotesque investments in death and destruction via climate chaos and war. Here to talk more about BlackRock's big problem, particularly with regards to climate justice, is Diana Best, senior finance campaigner with BlackRock's big problem. Take a look.
Let's start with the basics here. What are asset managers?
Asset managers are a particular industry group within the overall finance industry that take your money or institutional investors' monies like pension funds, and they turn around and invest it in the market for you. So they're a third party money manager on behalf of investors out there in the world.
And speaking of BlackRock in particular, they're a giant one who owns more coal, oil, and gas and rainforest destruction than any other U.S. company. Talk a little bit about BlackRock's assets.
So BlackRock, as you mentioned, is the world's largest asset manager. Their most recent filing put them at $6.5 trillion of assets under management. So they are managing a lot of money for a lot of people in the world. They operate in the US and they're headquartered here, but they also have business operations and clients all over the world and are investing in companies all over the world. As you said, because they're so huge and just their sheer size and volume, it makes them the largest single investor in new coal plant development companies worldwide, and also the largest investor in oil, coal, and gas extraction. They're also one of the biggest investors in rainforest destruction. So this is a huge company with a huge climate problem.
And there's something interesting that I'd like to pinpoint here, because obviously we as individuals are subject to the variance of laws between different countries, right? And BlackRock, as you noted, is based in the United States, but obviously we don't have rainforests. So if they're fueling rainforest destruction, that must be elsewhere. What about accountability with this? What about in terms of how they're able to manage these cross-border assets?
That's a great question. So I think this actually gets to what we're seeing as a real disconnect between what BlackRock is saying and actually how they're turning around and investing money. So BlackRock, especially Larry Fink, their CEO, talks a lot about social purpose of companies and the importance of looking at risk issues like climate change, gender inequality, issues around indigenous free prior informed consent. So BlackRock is a very outspoken about the needs for so-called responsible investing and takes a lot of pride in really trying to be almost like a good guy of Wall Street. And yet when we turn around, we're seeing that BlackRock is actually pumping money into companies that are doing the very thing which they're talking against.
Talk about how your work specifically with BlackRock kind of folds into the larger divestment movement, because we've seen people target banks like Wells Fargo or Bank of America with regards to specific pipeline projects, for instance. How does this work fold into that?
So I think there's an amazing movement happening worldwide where people who care about the climate, people who have their money invested in these companies or are using banking services or are using asset managers like BlackRock to invest their money are really waking up and saying, wait a second, we actually have a stake in this and we want our dollars to be used towards again bringing us in line with a livable climate, not just sort of blindly going to these companies that are continuing to destroy the environment, are driving the climate crisis, are violating indigenous rights, and so on. So I think there's been a real focus and attention in the last handful of years, particularly on banks and the role that banks play in underwriting loans for various fossil fuel projects worldwide, as well as, that are managing people's money. I think everybody can relate to a bank. It's where you have your checking account. It might be where you have your mortgage, et cetera. So using their voice and their leverage to do that. What's so interesting for us about this BlackRock work and really starting to focus on asset managers is we're going after actually an entire different sector of the finance system that has for a long time done something called passive investing, meaning they're just spreading the investment dollars across the entirety of the market, including into all this stuff that we don't want to be investing in. So I think really the climate movement and people worldwide starting to look at the entirety of the finance system and saying where all of the different angles and levers that we can work on to just try and reduce the amount of money going into fossil fuel companies and forest destroying companies.
And the really kind of scary thing about asset managers like BlackRock is, there's a branch of Wells Fargo that you could go to have a protest or something. But where would there's no BlackRock branch, there's no friendly neighborhood BlackRock office that you can go to and say, hey, this is really messed up. I'm pulling my money from you, because most people, us little people, so to speak, don't have enough money to use asset managers.
I think you're right. We joke that it's the biggest company you've never heard of. $6.5 trillion of assets under management. This is a behemoth of a company that's operating worldwide, and very little people know what BlackRock even is. That being said, part of what our campaign is aiming to do is really pull back the curtain and expose who are some of these shadow players that have such a heavy hand in driving the climate crisis by continuing to pump money into these companies, which are destroying the rainforest, continuing to build coal plants, continuing to extract oil, gas, tar sands, and coal. But it's definitely hard. What's interesting is that BlackRock actually touches most people's life. So if you have a 401k, if you have a pension fund, if you are investing in or doing any kind of investments in the market, most likely you're touching BlackRock in some way, shape, or form. There's also increasingly investment apps that are really being targeted towards a younger millennial generation of investors. You may have heard of some of them: Stash, Acorn, Robinhood, etc. A lot of those are also hustling BlackRock products, although it's not necessarily super obvious unless you really read the fine print that these are actually BlackRock products. Which actually brings me to an interesting new point. Speaking of a next generation of investors, we're seeing massive changes and shifts happening in the investment market right now, and a real focus and trend towards investing in sustainable products or responsible investing products. So those are called something called ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance screened funds. So these are technically funds which have applied a additional criteria on what's the bare minimum that companies have to hit in terms of their environmental and social and governance responsibility in order to be sort of allowed into this special sustainable or ESG fund. BlackRock has noticed this trend and has responded by introducing a whole slew of new ESG screened products. When you actually pull back the curtain or peek under the hood of what's in those ESG funds, particularly in the United States, we're still seeing coal companies in there. We're seeing companies that are destroying the rainforest. We're seeing oil and gas. So even the funds that they're marketing as sustainable still have all of this stuff in there that most people like you and I, when we look at the word sustainable, that's where we want to put our investment dollars. We certainly don't think we're putting those dollars into the very industries that we're trying to fight against. In Europe, BlackRock is marketing ESG products, which are automatically taking out thermal coal and tar sands. And yet with their US marketed products and products that they're marketing in other parts of the world, they still call it sustainable, and yet we're seeing those sort of sin companies or those big heavy fossil fuel companies like coal and tar sands still in those ESG funds.
Is that due to regulation in Europe where you can't actually market something as sustainable if it's clearly not?
Yeah, I think it's a result of regulation and stronger oversight for sure. It's also a result of increasing investor demand that's been pretty clear in Europe that institutional investors like pension funds or even retail investors want cleaner products. So they're getting demands from their clients or the people that they're investing their money for that they actually need to apply stronger and stricter screens to what's considered sustainable. And so I think it's a combination. What I would say though is that just because there isn't the same kind of regulatory environment and someone kind of keeping everything in line in the US right now, although ultimately we very much need that here, just because there isn't that same regulatory environment doesn't mean that BlackRock should not be applying the same integrity and standards that they're offering in other parts of their business.
Right. And again, I mean, a law is only as good as the enforcement of it. So even if we had that law here in the States, and we know from ample evidence, particularly when it comes to environmental regulation, enforcement is despicably lax. So even if we had that regulation, there's nothing to say that anybody would demand that BlackRock stick to it. So really it has to do with, just like anything else, educating and engaging people and having that demand come from the people as opposed to a top-down approach.
Definitely. And having BlackRock's investment policies and their business model match the rhetoric that they're already out there saying. Part of the concern of that, or I think the real issue with that, is a lot of people see the name BlackRock, and because of all the good things that they've said, already that trust is there, and they're already assuming and applying that integrity. Their name is very powerful amongst sort of the finance world, and it really must mean that BlackRock actually needs to live up to their own name and needs to live up to their own rhetoric.
Yeah, it's the enforcement has to come from people digging and learning where their money goes, rather than just trusting the tagline of a company.
Definitely. So, as just one very specific example, BlackRock markets an exchange traded fund, which is marked sustainable on their website and called a low carbon fund. It contains Valero, at least to date right now, because these can change a little bit. It contains Valero. It contains a Japanese coal company. It contains Enbridge. This is something called low carbon, and yet if you peek behind the curtains again, you start to see just the amount of fossil fuel investment that's in there.
And so finally, one more thing, because as we spoke about earlier, you can pull your money out of Bank of America, right? It's not terribly easy, but you can just say, hey, I'm going to this local bank that isn't an asshole. It seems like it might be difficult, particularly if you're just investing, if you hand your money to some sort of investment firm, or you have a 401k that works with BlackRock. It can seem very difficult to then decide, I'm going to pull my money. How would you suggest that people try to find out where their money might be going?
Asking a lot of questions of your 401k provider, asking what funds they're investing your money into, and making it very clear that we demand funds which are not fueling the climate crisis. So again, at a standard, that's not only putting our investment dollars into ESG products or things that are already screened for some of that, but then also asking the question, since we know that ESG is a very loose term and sustainable can mean a lot of things, and there isn't a ton of oversight on what that is, making sure that we're asking and demanding for fossil fuel free funds and funds that are free of forest destroying commodities that are also driving the climate crisis. So I think just asking those questions and starting to get more savvy about how your investment dollars are being invested on your behalf. I think this is an industry that's operated for a long time in just sort of blindly investing across the market. We don't have the luxury of doing that anymore with how critical the climate crisis is, nor do people really want to be investing in companies which, in addition to climate change, are not taking gender equality seriously, where there's wage gap issues, where there's issues around healthcare access and where healthcare is being provided. So we, as a generation of investors, need to be a lot more willing to ask tough questions and be demanding where our money is being spent and invested.
And of course, that's a brilliant point, too, because it points out how interconnected all of these issues are. The issues not just of climate change, but women's rights, indigenous rights. And I recently saw that the Color of Change, that organization, put out a call to ask people to call on BlackRock with regards, apparently they're the biggest shareholder of Facebook outside of Facebook, and asking them to deal with the issue of civil rights and human rights abuses that have been perpetuated by Facebook. So, the interconnectedness of these issues is a really profound point that you made as well.
To learn more about BlackRock and the important work that a target like this represents, visit blackrocksbigproblem.com. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Reminder, the best way to stay up to date on our work is to sign up for the newsletter at the address below. Please do share this with all of your friends, foes, and people that you don't know. Until next week, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left one of you motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch. We got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and set my shove. I'm not a